مرحبا. نرجع مع الجلسة الأخيرة من المؤتمر. هاي الجلسة رح يكون التركيز فيها على التحولات في النظرية النسوية مع التغيرات النيوليبرالية اللي صارت. رح يكون في طرح عن قضية العلاقة بين النسوية والإمبريالية، ابتعاد النسوية عن التحليل البنيوي والتحليل التاريخي، وتفضيلها التركيز على جزئيات قضايا بتتعلق بالهوية والفاعلية الذاتية، بعيداً عن تناول القضايا اللي بتنتج أو تحليل البنى اللي بتنتج علاقات عدم المساواة. وكيف هذا التجاهل عم بيلعب دور أساسي كمان في إنتاج ردات الفعل المعادية للنسوية. رح نبلش الجلسة مع دكتورة فرانسس هاسو، أستاذة في برنامج دراسات النوع الاجتماعي الجنسانية والنسوية في جامعة ديوك في الولايات المتحدة. أستاذة فرانسس كتبت عن النساء العربيات، عن النساء في فلسطين وفي البحرين، عن الأشكال المقاومة الجماعية والنضالات المختلفة اللي بتدخل فيها النساء. تفضلي أستاذة فرانسس.
شكرا. راح أتكلم بالإنجليزي. I'm honored to be here to listen and share. I watched most of the presentations yesterday. I just wanted to say that I'm also in the Black Alliance for Peace Solidarity Network and involved in something called the International Manifesto Group. So the title of my presentation today is A Double Helix, Feminist Theory and Imperialism. The paper emerged from a fall 2022 postgraduate seminar co-taught by myself and Anna Krylova, who's joining us today, at Duke University, titled Feminist Theory and Imperialism. We examined the conundrum of why the most foregrounded Western feminist theorizing avoids directly challenging structural political economic inequality, including capitalism and imperialism, and often reproduces liberal and neoliberal expressive or cultural subjectivity and identity as sources of empowerment within those national and global systems. I find that theory innovations in these fields are more and more oriented to abstract, granular, or microscopic scales as objects of analysis to make it easier to produce easily transportable or modular concepts across time, place, and space without attending to context or material relations of inequality at multiple scales in serious ways, if at all. The seminar allowed a collective, collaborative setting to work through an increasing sense, my increasing sense at least, over 20 years in US academic institutions, that Western feminist and queer scholarship and teaching continue largely to reproduce racial capitalism in its liberal and progressive forms and imperialism in the Leninist sense, while appearing to be radical or counter-hegemonic. Even when this scholarship seems interested in global or transnational dynamics, it typically reproduces the material and ideological point of view of its Western imperialist, national, and institutional location, as Lila Fernandez has argued and shown. I have come to understand this problem as a systemic feature rather than an easily resolved problem that we can fix with more citations and syllabus sources or by quote unquote internationalizing the curriculum, the goal for many transnational feminist scholars in the West since the 1980s. Like many of you, I have the biological, social, cultural, and historical knowledge to challenge essentialized and ahistorical understandings of sex and gender, but we are actively directed away from understanding the economic systems that produce inequality and align in particular historical and contextual ways with patriarchal, racist, homophobic, and other differentiations to intensify subordination and surplus extraction, or extract more surplus. Many universal, quote unquote, feminist and queer gender and sexuality concepts travel in academic, corporate, foundation, governmental, and NGO sectors around the world, while mystifying their ideological and material interests and contexts and reinforcing extraction and repression. It will be obvious to socialist, anti-imperialist, and anti-colonial feminists that the US State Department, USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, and large foundations and corporations in the US and politically adjacent or vassal countries mobilize feminist and queer-friendly concepts and projects to maintain hegemony. It is less obvious how some of the best work in the field is part of and reproduces the same or similar material relations and ideological terms. In addition to reproducing the hegemony of English as the language of theory and knowledge, these concepts and projects show little interest in their relevance or irrelevance to other histories, epistemologies, priorities, and debates, as well as to global and national, racial, capitalist, and other relations of inequality in which we are implicated. Often these histories, knowledges, priorities, and debates are deracinated of their context and reformulated to fit within hegemonic understandings in Western academies. This paper is an early effort at tracing the historical emergence and conditions connecting feminism and imperialism since the 70s, which I understand through the visual metaphor of the double helix of DNA. Two backbone strands connected by discursive materialist rungs, expressed mostly through institutions at different historical moments. Those of us who study this question historically know there is a long modern history, indeed histories, connecting gender concerns and imperialist and colonialist projects. We are also well aware of reactionary gender and sexuality projects of all kinds, whether they draw on religion, culture, or nature to make their claims. I am orienting my lens to more complex gender and sexuality projects that seem to be genuinely addressing gender and sexual injustice. One of the most important rungs in the double helix is the United Nations, especially the UN Decade for Women, whose 75th conference was held in Mexico City. The UN as an expression of geopolitical and economic power takes twists and turns in how it attaches feminism to imperialism, but it does so persistently and circulates powerfully in multiple organizations that feed into and off the UN, which, to state the obvious, is a Western capitalist and imperialist dominated structure and was set up like this from the beginning. The next rung is the so-called Washington Consensus, led by Western capitalist institutions and governments in the 80s, especially the Reagan-led US and Thatcher-led UK. The third is the New World Order, implemented most dramatically within the Western NATO dismemberment of Iraq and Yugoslavia after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the 90s, and it keeps on ticking all over the world. The final rung for my purposes today is the War on Terror, which was immediately preceded by worldwide challenges to the World Trade Organization and the World Economic Forum in Seattle and Genoa, among other places. A Western feminist scholarly tradition tracks anti-imperialist transnational feminist projects that came before and even set the stage for the 1955 Bandung Conference. These were transnational feminist conferences, predominantly organized, led, and attended by third world women, most of them socialists, anti-colonialists, and anti-imperialists, coming from societies victimized by Western colonialism and imperialism. Examining the 49 Conference of the Women of Asia, held in Beijing in 49, Elizabeth Anderson, I don't know if that's Anderson or Armstrong, but I think it's Anderson, shows participants' distinct setting distinct setting apart from the priorities of feminists in imperialist and colonizing core countries and solidarity with each other's struggles. Anderson focuses on the least studied strand of these transnational anti-imperialist feminist projects, quote, leftist mass-based feminism, which sought to restructure the economy as well as social relations and cultural and political practices to enfranchise all women, unquote. What she calls leftist women's internationalism in the colonized and imperialized world, quote, often overlapped with nationalist and state feminism in significant ways due to a shared commitment to women's legal and state-based inclusion. Like revolutionary feminist nationalism, leftist feminism encompassed violent and nonviolent strategies and tactics, unquote, and differed from liberal feminist projects in persistently demanding, quote, substantive changes in the existing relations of production and reproduction, unquote. Such movements continued to work even after revolution succeeded. As she and other scholars note, much of our knowledge of these anti-imperialist feminist efforts in the 40s and 50s, and I would add in the present, quote, is fraught by analytical frames and terms imported from the Cold War, unquote, and its related, quote, Orientalist oppositions, unquote, and assumptions that socialist and revolutionary women were and are dupes of communist states and parties rather than active members and even critics within. An other side of the coin problem framed and frames liberal and progressive transnational feminist organizations as somehow non-political, quote unquote, and innocent, quote unquote, of the Cold War. And I would add to her point, imperialist and colonialist priorities in the present. Jumping ahead historically, a stated goal of the UN Decade for Women was to, quote, integrate women across the world into, quote, economic development. And this is from Getz. However, the terms of economic rising were set by the capitalist imperialist Western powers that dominated and continue to dominate the UN. In an article criticizing the failures of this gender development goal 13 years after the Mexico City conference, Anne-Marie Getz occasionally mentions the necessity of systemic change and imperialism as a major barrier, but resorts to postmodernist questioning of the ontological and epistemological category of woman as universal, and to familiar equality versus difference arguments that dominated feminist scholarship in the late 80s. Her 1988 essay shares with a lot of such critical feminist scholarship avoidance of socialism and capitalism as competing systems within which gender contradictions are dealt with very differently. The capitalist framework within which much of the gender mainstreaming, empowerment, and equality projects and discourses work is unnamed. That is the definition of hegemony in the Gramscian sense. Post-structuralism and equality versus difference arguments were theory-making opportunities in feminist scholarship in the 80s and 90s that helped feminists, us, avoid naming and challenging systemic sources of poverty worldwide, such as colonialism, imperialism, war, and sanctions, and the attached suffering experienced in particular ways by poor women and children in the global South. As I hope is already clear, the UN is an under-recognized engine of liberal and neoliberal gender concepts that are quickly taken up by Western academic, government, corporate, and NGO entities, and then imposed or taken up all over the world. For example, Ranju Sidhu has recently written about, quote, women's rights as human rights movement, which is, quote, predicated on the liberal individualist conception of human rights and gender equality, unquote, and works on the basis of the UN's 79 adoption of the CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This concept, she shows, is typically used, quote, to pressure ratifying non-Western states to transform their non-liberal cultures by incorporating its liberal individualist principles into their domestic legal systems, unquote, and has been, quote, enthusiastically embraced, unquote, by human rights activists in the global South. This has been read by, quote, Western feminists as evidence that the women's right as human rights movement exemplifies transnational feminist solidarity, unquote. Although Her argues that, among other things, quote, it erodes culturally diverse modes of gender justice in the global South, unquote. This includes indigenous, quote, collective right to self-determination that promotes intracultural gender justice, unquote, based on local feminist understandings of culture as socially malleable. During the first UN decade, Kristen Godsey finds that while Western feminists largely used international fora to advocate for women's legal rights, quote, women from the socialist countries proposed that the equality between men and women would be useless in a world full of greater injustices such as racism, colonialism, underdevelopment, and war, unquote. A third position was taken by women from 77 independent global South countries that held, quote, a majority of seats in the UN General Assembly. And this is in the 70s. They increasingly challenged Western feminist, Western countries and advocated for what they called a new international economic order that would end imperialism and radically redistribute the world's wealth, unquote. Godsey shows that English language feminist scholars of the UN have generally ignored the activism of socialist women and the continuing efforts to achieve sexual and gender equality in socialist and communist countries because they accuse them, again, of being dupes of their governments and parties, which I find to be a very familiar argument. And it's often evoked in Palestine in relation to nationalism and national self-determination. Here, gender as an axis of inequality and extraction is separated from other structural demands for development and redistribution. The Washington Consensus of the 80s also saw the rise of third world and transnational feminism, third wave feminism, intersectionality, and as I already mentioned, post-structuralism in Western feminist academies. There's no time to get into each of these concepts, but I will say that the concept of intersectionality, which arose in the late 80s and early 90s, continues to operate as another individual identity rather than system-focused deflection in the ways it has traveled from the US and been taken up without its ideological and material context of production. These ways of thinking and concepts were dominant in the 90s when I was a graduate student. That is, as US-led warmongering capitalism attempted to consolidate and empower itself, sponsoring and installing repressive governments, juntas, and wars around the world that killed millions, continued to stand strong against governments and movements that tried to improve their societies, including many assassinations, and weakened welfare state provisions and commitments to the environmental commons. Western feminism turned inward and continued the path of differentiating the category of woman and schools of Western feminism, producing a lot of theory. This continued the process of centering the West in intellectual spheres and mystifying the workings of imperialism and capitalism and our own institutions and intellectual classes as part of this. Rather than frontally approaching geopolitical power, maldistributions, scholarship turned to subjectivity, identity, equality, and difference among women. This cannot be a coincidence. Academic institutions, even if intellectual projects within them are feminist, are part of the ideological superstructure and institutionally and materially constrained. The end of the USSR was seen by the US and its NATO and European Union allies, or vassals, depending on how one wants to define them, as an opportunity to rampage a new world order of consolidation of multinational and ultimately monopoly capitalism. I'm almost done. And attacks on governments that dare to consider or chart independent foreign and economic policies. critical transnational feminist scholarship in the West from the 90s onward was occasionally anti-imperialist and anti-war, and had a lot to say about the implications of capitalist Western hegemony, but often relied on the language of globalization and neoliberalism. It typically reinforced the US and other Western spaces as the centers of those debates. Too often, this critical scholarship turned to resistant feminist subjectivities and identities to global capital in the global South and global North as the focus of concept development. Indeed, we feminists have been well trained to fetishize the grassroots, quote unquote, and stay in our places at that scale. Most feminists challenging the neoliberal consensus on gender and empowerment, development, and mainstreaming in governmental and NGO capitalist institutions, which are dominated by a feminist technocratic class, either ignore or dismiss socialist and communist states as crucial vehicles of revolutionary transformation. What does that mean for the billions of people and thousands of movements that insist that their governments substantially protect them from geriatric capitalism and involve themselves in providing for the public good? Leftist women and queers in the global South, especially those in movements led by the class, caste, and racially disfranchised, have continued to insist that feminist liberation requires redistribution, including socialism, and is not possible under conditions of imperialist wars, externally sponsored color revolutions, and sanctions. I have a lot more to say, but I'll stop given the time limits. Thank you.
Thank you, Frances. There's a lot actually to think about, and maybe we can get back to many of these important ideas later in the discussion. Now we move to أنا كيريلوفا. أنا هي أستاذة مشاركة في جامعة ديوك في دائرة التاريخ ودراسات النوع الاجتماعي والجنسانية. بتركز في دراستها على روسيا في القرن العشرين وتحديات تصور بناء بديل اشتراكي في زمن ما بعد الاستعمار والعولمة. تفضلي أنا. You're muted. You're mute.
Thank you. I will just repeat myself. It is a great pleasure to be here. And I want to thank the conference organizers for bringing all of us together and for this opportunity to talk about my current book project, which is a collection of essays. This book project was very deeply impacted by the seminar that Frances just talked about. And as a matter of fact, one of the essays, Agency and History, is going to come out this month in American Historical Review. But back to the collection. The collection tells a history of the Western social sciences encounter with post-structuralist, postmodern theory at the turn of the century, and examines as to what has happened to Western analytics, by which I mean its core categories and modes of analysis as a result of this encounter. So given the fact that since the 1980s, as many speakers have already talked about, this resultant post-structuralist analysis that nowadays actually dominates much of American social sciences have been relentlessly exported across the globe, a clear and critical understanding of what has happened in Western social sciences, like most immediately in history, sociology, anthropology, political science, is of uttermost importance. Even if we think we know what happened, because I actually think we do not fully understand the scale and scope of occurred changes and their history. So today, I actually would like to talk just about two kinds of changes in the ways post-structuralist pioneers have transformed the study of society in the West. And this is what we're talking about. How do we actually study society and all the complex issues that come with it, and how they moved this study away from the preceding dominant approaches, for example, those of the Marxist Gramscian schools of historical analysis and literary theory, that had dominated Western social sciences well into the early 1980s. So as a result of these developments, as I want to show, some once indispensable categories of social analysis, such as structure, the state, the class, exploitation, revolutionary subjectivity, and of course materialism, have been discredited and marginalized, while other categories still in use, such as power, resistance, agency, empowerment, emancipation, liberation, have been dramatically de-radicalized, I argue. So in my larger work and a number of essays, I take kind of several deep dives into these processes of marginalization and de-radicalization of mainstream Western analytics, something granted I cannot do here today. So what follows is a very short course of few key arguments and examples, and I would still like to preempt them with a brief contextualization of this very complex and broad history. So in the US, the history of this epistemic transformation that I trace in the book begins at a telling historical juncture, the commencement of the neoliberal remaking of the world in the late 20th century, and the American Academy's turbulent, but not accidental in my opinion, encounter with post-structuralist modes of inquiry. And champions of those modes of inquiry called upon their respective disciplines to critically re-evaluate preceding forms of social analysis and social theory. So the post-war Marxist school of historical analysis and literary criticism, for example, was among the principal analytical casualties of this encounter with post-structuralism. Also, it is important to mention that in the US, this popularization of post-structuralist insights was led by feminist scholars who were at once pioneers of post-structuralist and postmodern analysis and founders of such new fields of inquiry as gender studies, gender theory, gender history, also decolonial studies, feminist decolonial studies, and kind of a number of major explosion of studies and production of new fields of knowledge were created in the 80s and 90s, as we know. So the Marxist tradition, for example, and I have an article devoted specifically to what happened to Western Marxism between the 60s and the present, was announced by radical feminists in line with the general post-structuralist critique to be outdated, analytically naive, and politically suspect. So what was outdated, analytically naive, and politically suspect about Marxism? This is another complex set of questions, but I just want to remind us that among many things, the critique was carried out under the banner of totalizing forms of knowledge. And the Marxist tradition was believed to embody one of the most vivid examples of such intellectual flaws. So in place of totalizing approaches to the study of society, feminist pioneers of post-structuralist analysis proposed, well, a fragmented, mutable, unfixed, open-ended, and so on, model of society. And I do want to add that this new way of looking at the world was often presented not as a tool of analysis, but as things really were in the world. So the discourse actually still carries into the present is that kind of the post-structuralist framework allows us to see, it actually captures the reality, even though post-structuralism actually refused the notion of reality. So already in the 1980s, Marxist feminists in the West and outside Western academies worried that the rejection of what was referred to as totalizing forms of knowledge would lead naturally to the subsequent move away from the study of large-scale structures and regularities and their inbuilt local and global mechanisms of domination and exploitation. So indeed, this is exactly what happened. And this is what Frances already covered in her presentation. So I will call this kind of anti-totalizing mode of analysis. Some scholars described as scaling down analytics. And this is how, for example, Kathy Weeks has recently summed up these developments on account of feminist theory in the West, which I will paraphrase here. So having eschewed large-scale structures and social totalities, feminist theorists have embraced a new mandate, a new project, to pluralize and specify, to drill down to the particular and to the subjective. So the focus of feminist theory as a result has turned from regularities to singularities, from commonalities to difference, and from business as usual to states of exception. So in the remaining time, I propose to further explore the consequences of this scaling down epistemology. Let us, for example, look at what actually happened to cardinal categories of social analysis that feminist scholars in the West did not shun away from, but in fact continue to rely on heavily, such as resistance, power, agency, emancipation, liberation, conflict, struggle. So the question is, what do those once rather formidable categories mean today when the feminist scholar begins her research with the unfixed and mutable peculiarities of everyday life of the oppressed, and relegates questions of undergirding structures of social ills and injustices to the margins of her analysis? So if I have already preempted my answer, I believe that those categories get profoundly de-radicalized. So let me give you an example to demonstrate as to how these processes of de-radicalization work in in academic texts. To do that, I turn to a rather earlier text, which is actually not a feminist, and it's not a feminist text, but it had a deep impact on all social sciences in the West. And because I have very little time, it's just the most effective way to demonstrate the point. The book is it's a 1985 academic bestseller by James Scott called Weapons of the Weak, and it basically introduced several generations of feminist and anti-feminist political scientists, anthropologists, historians to post-structuralist theories of society, and demonstrated how post-structuralist insights into kind of this mutating, fragmented, unstructured, and open-ended, allegedly open-ended kind of view of the world can be used as an interpretive tool in concrete research projects. So in Weapons of the Week, this book is devoted to a small Malaysian village and its peasant inhabitants. In this book, Scott challenges what he calls the heroic or revolutionary concept of the protagonist of the Marxist tradition. And that Marxist protagonist's goal, of course, was to overthrow existing structures of social and cultural domination. In its place, in the place of this Marxist revolutionary heroic character, Scott proposes a subject who resists and exercises agency, well, to quote, prosaically, constantly, and even creatively, but in everyday life. So such a subject agent doesn't need to worry about undergirding structures that circumscribe his or her social and cognitive routines. In fact, anticipating feminist historians by nearly half a decade, Scott described this anti-hero as a manipulative and versatile actor who knew well how to work systems of subjugation to their minimum disadvantage by means of everyday resistance, food dragging, dissimulation, false compliance, feigned ignorance, mocking, parody, talking back, and of course, playing with language. So in Scott's scenario, in other words, the concept of agency, resistance, and empowerment now basically meant nothing less, no more than his protagonists' day-to-day grit and coping with an unjust world to the best of their abilities. They are resisting and being agents by simply living their lives, subverting. This is the term, that's why the term is very important to me, subverting, contesting, sometimes even modifying conditions of the oppression, but operating within structural constraints of oppression. So what is left out of such an innovative approach to human agency and resistance in Western scholarship is actually a lot. For example, among the things that are left out is the question of whether and how humans could effectively disengage from dominant regimes of oppression and signification and participate in the construction of socio-cultural alternatives. So I have used Scott's book here because it effectively captures for us the standard protagonist of Western social sciences today, including feminist and gender scholarship. So in gender history, this protagonist basically can be found across various periods and across all geographies. I would challenge you to find a book that deals with the underprivileged and the oppressed and that doesn't invoke and doesn't complement those subjects with their kind of agency and resistance, while actually nothing structurally changes in their lives and in the books of those scholars. So already by the mid-1990s, this de-radicalized version of what it meant to resist and to be an agent acquired an elegant theoretical formulation among post-structuralist feminist historians and social scientists. For example, it became first possible and then routine to assert that it was no longer warranted to counterpose humans' underprivileged, unequal, even oppressed positions in a society to their prospects to live their lives, quote, as active actors of history. So in this reading, Marx's problematic insight, basically kind of the only Marxist dictum that is being repeated over and over again, that people have no choice but to make history under conditions not of their choosing, that constrain them and that limit the terms of their struggles, was and explicitly used not as a problem, which it was for Marx and for Marxists, but as a solution to the agency dilemma. So this move was remarkably productive for kind of within the Western epistemic tradition. Today, as a result of these developments, feminist scholars in the West have found a way to discover acts of resistance in an infinite number of social activities, which actually makes us wonder what resistance means if it can be found everywhere, and with an exception of attempting a structural change.
Anna,
Am I running out of time?
Yeah, kind of. If you can finish in 1 minute.
In 1 minute, I definitely can. So to empower humans and to treat them as agents and complement them as such, actually in virtually in all societal positions also becomes possible. So in this approach, a scholar treats agency and resistance, categories that not long ago carried anti-systemic connotations, as endemic and, as Foucault unambiguously explained, constitutive or belonging to the system of oppression themselves. So you actually don't, in order to resist, you don't even no longer need to step outside of the oppressive regime. So these theoretical interpretive moves constitute a dramatic act of de-radicalization indeed. And to conclude, I just want to contrast these new interpretive moves, which are now dominant in Western scholarship, against the actual historical background of the past 50 years. So as I look back at the past decades, I'm struck by the telling irony, namely that it was precisely when, in the name of neoliberal liberation of humanity, the power of labor was curbed, whole sectors of economy privatized, markets deregulated, welfare safety nets, however few in the West, undermined or thrown away, and the workings of capitalism and imperialism acquired an update and a boost. This was the time when scholars, basically historians, together with social scientists and other scholars working in humanities, found a way to empower humans virtually in any societal position, no matter how underprivileged, exploited, marginalized this or that position might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And yeah, that was really insightful and provocative, I'd say. And we'll have a lot to discuss, I guess, by the end of the session. So we move now to Chloe سكينر. كلوي باحثة في دراسات السلطة والسياسة الشعبية الجماعية في معهد دراسات التنمية. تركيزها على النوع الاجتماعي والجنسانية الاستعمارية العنف والمقاومة. تفضلي كلوي.
Thanks, Amira. Let me just share my screen. Sorry, technological. Okay, can you see my screen? Thank you. I'll just make it big. Perfect. Thanks everyone for being here, and thank you for inviting me to speak, and thank you also to the speakers who've spoken before me and also the interpreters. So this presentation is drawing on a co-written paper by myself, Jurka Edstrom and Alan Gregg, and it's forthcoming for publication in Science. And it draws on conceptual work to understand global forms of backlash across the CEDAR-funded Countering Backlash Action-Orientated Research Programme at the Institute of Development Studies. So I won't go through each of these, but this is just to say that the amazing work of each of these 10 partners across 4 regions have contributed to the reading of Backlash that I'm going to present. So to introduce, across the globe, regressive, authoritarian and populist actors have grown in popularity and power, peddling and asserting misogynistic, heterosexist and patently racist policies, practice and discourse. So defining this moment as one of backlash against intersectional and liberatory radical feminism, I'm going to offer a reading of these forces as forms of heteropatriarchal crisis management. As a confluence of crises, political, economic, climate, and pandemic have created volatility in hierarchical social relations, threatening the reproduction of elite rule and capitalist growth. So we suggest that ontological insecurity in the face of real or imagined or manufactured crises is being harnessed by various backlash actors, who then offer a sense of order and border in the face of a perceived disorder, functioning to fix in place hierarchies and binarisms surrounding the body, the family, and nation. So just briefly, I'm going to talk about what I mean by backlash. So backlash can manifest as overt, as direct attack against women, queers, migrants, or so on. It can be physical, it can be institutional. It can also be subtle. It can be constituted by inaction, co-option, or depoliticization. It can be discursive. It can be the co-option of liberatory discourses, as other speakers have so powerfully demonstrated, or through undercover or overt myth-making, for example, through demonization, appropriation, stigmatization, retraditionalization. For example, moral panic around queer politics and people, notions that women should be homemakers, abortionists, or baby killers, etc. This can operate in policy spaces, civic spaces, and popular spaces, operating on international and national to local scales. So backlash against liberatory politics, we argue, is not always about gender, but it's always gendered. As Wendy Brown writes in relation to the rise of the far right in both North America and Europe, if white men cannot own democracy, there will be no democracy. Sure, sorry. Yeah. And if white men cannot rule the planet, there will be no planet. Sorry, I can hear the interpreter. Do I need to press anything? No problem. So actors kind of peddling backlash politics are diverse and increasingly converging. Yet they all mobilize against gender as a primary battleground through which contextually contingent privileged groups can seek to restore, maintain, or reassert their power and position. And there's a confluence of these actors, from men's rights movements or gender critical feminists to world leaders, fundamentalist, conservative religious forces, ethno-nationalist, fascist, or authoritarian forces, as well as hyper-capitalists or neoconservative capitalists. And alliances between these are opportunistic and often rally behind autocratic politicians. There's often contradictions in their narratives. They're united in their opposition to gender, but their aims and underlying interests often do not align. They appeal to past orders, but they're often very deeply nihilistic. They're anti-global in their rhetoric, and yet they're always transnationally linked. So just to briefly look at types of backlash and how it's been framed in literature, some of which are deeply problematic. It's variously understood in terms of resistance, restoration, or a broader reactionary politics. So first, there's a defensive framing of backlash, which draws on Susan Felidi's early and US-centric definition of backlash as referring to episodic and acute opposition to progress in women's rights. Yet this frame is problematic in terms of positionality and narratives of progress. From whose perspective has there been progress? What form does this take? And is backlash more than simply one step forward, 2 steps back? More critical then, critical race analyses of backlash read it as preemptive, seeing it instead as a protective mechanism for the longer term survival of hierarchical and existing systems of power. Rowley challenges the framing of backlash as reactionary and instead theorizes it as a condition of modernity, whereby backlash is an inherent systemic feature that operates and is sparked to maintain oppressive power dynamics once an explicit do not cross boundary is passed. Backlash can be proactive, functioning in service of other visions for radical change, which may not focus primarily on gender, but which are still heteropatriarchal. Ethno-nationalist, far-right, or neo-fascist movements actively promote anti-feminist or anti-queer agendas, even if driven more fundamentally by racism or ambitions for ethnic cleansing. Finally, alliances between conservative religious groups and far-right movements and politicians go broader still in the building of opportunistic approaches to end anti-gender. Kuher and Paternotte argue that across anti-gender movements, gender is functioning as a symbolic glue, allowing actors with diverging goals and strategies to coalesce and work against a common enemy. So moving to our reading, why now and why is there such a globalized uptick in backlash and far-right politics? We argue that recent actual or manufactured crises are being harnessed almost as a form of disaster patriarchy, drawing on Klein's disaster capitalism, in the face of a global sense of anxiety and uncertainty over how we understand the world, our place in it, or as Giddens terms, our ontological security. Such anxious states generate a strong effective force for identification with backlash politics and alliances with populist anti-gender or right-wing agendas, all of which offer a supposedly more deserved and secure self-image and future. So by manufactured crises, what I mean is the so-called migrant crisis or masculinity crisis, and actual crises, i.e. climate crisis or economic crises, and related anxieties and cleavages are then used and exploited through divisive populist politics, mobilizing support for authoritarian solutions. Backlash therefore emerges organically as attempts by different powerful interest groups manage such crises through spatial fixes in three symbolic and actual battlegrounds, namely the body, the family, and the nation. As such, diverse policies, discourse, and practices that are contextually contingent yet resonant the world over operate to fix in space the individual space in the binary sexed body as heteronormative, the privatized space of the traditional family as hetero or mononormative, patriarchal and hierarchical, and the bordered, ordered space of the ethnically imagined nation as homogenizing, exclusive, and othering. Governments dream of docile, domesticated, and privatized lives, Verges reminds us, and the alleged security of fixing bodies, families, and nations in place as neat, bordered, ordered, binary, and hierarchical is then set in contradistinction with the chaos allegedly imposed by the liberation of various others, whether women, queers, indigenous peoples, migrants, or so on, to be vanquished or contained by any rhetorical or practical means possible. So meanwhile, while these forces that are actually precipitating this state of chaos and crisis in which we variably exist is occluded, namely colonial and neo-colonial forms of power, domination and extraction, rampant militarization, predatory neoliberal capitalism, and related uneven processes of destruction. These are hidden behind these simplistic narratives. So I'm going to turn briefly to each of these sites. And there's countless examples I could give from different spaces, but I will just offer a couple. So first, gender ideology, related movements, discourses, and politics operationalize heteronormative anxieties surrounding the destabilization of naturalized gender binaries. Here, it is not only deviant bodies that pose a threat, but even ideas pertaining to gender as a changeable social construct. Coined by the Vatican in the 90s, gender ideology was conceived as a threat in response to women's movements mobilizations that built on longer-term struggles for reproductive justice and bodily autonomy. As increasingly intersectional struggles, these presented a deeper challenge to heteropatriarchy. triggering a more fervent opposition from constellations of theocrats and conservatives. Gender ideology frames queers, feminists, critical race theorists as set on a nihilistic agenda to endanger humankind, children, and the traditional, consolidating a discourse and a movement that sets a diverse cast of actors against gender as a form of ideological colonization, which provides a common yet malleable ground for a transnational movement to be mobilized against reproductive justice, comprehensive sexuality education, and queer movements and communities. Populist leaders ascribing to such discourses draw too on alleged crisis in masculinity, seeking to restore masculinized power through strongman politics and posturing, appealing directly to contextually specific masculinist and ethno-nationalist anxieties, offering an antidote for alleged emasculation in the male body and body politic, penetrated by threats as diverse as migrants, social justice warriors, woke agendas, feminism, anti-racism, and queer liberation. Beyond the body, the family too is another potent site of backlash politics, converging around nostalgic notions of tradition and reifying the family as protected and private. Early formations of men's movements were animated by resistance to men's changing status within the family in the global north, often focused on issues of divorce settlements and child custody. Similarly, in India, Basu finds that the men's rights movement primarily focuses on divorce and domestic violence laws, with messaging centered on heteronormative marital bliss as the ultimate social goal. As we heard yesterday, we see resistance to changes in personal status laws, while implementation of existing policies, for example, the Domestic Violence Act in Bangladesh, is stagnant and stalled, as dominant social norms stereotype domestic violence as a trivial, personal, and private matter. Finally, rooted in deeper resentments over supposedly inadequate resources, right-wing politics also stoke fears of the ethnic replacement related to othered or marginalized families' supposed higher fertility rates. Across the US, India, and Turkey, Smith et al. Analyzed various great replacement theories and demographic fever dreams that use, quote, vivid and fantastic fiction to amplify, imagine, and obscure demographic patterns of migration, birth, or mortality, consolidating political power, dismissing and undermining class tensions, and creating fictitious communities of homogeneity. Finally, the nation. Recent years have witnessed a revitalized symbiosis of anti-feminism and ethno-nationalism in protection of the national family. For example, in the Philippines, Duterte's strongman style of governance includes a distinct form of paternalism through which he justifies the horrifically violent drug war to protect the country and its children from falling prey to its most subversive elements. This builds on latent anxieties as he promises to bring an end to national chaos, to which Diaz attributes his electoral success in 2016. As in the case of gender ideology, feminism has also been identified with crises of national sovereignty, both as a rhetorical strategy and a geopolitical mover. Backlash actors have often co-opted an anti-colonial idiom, equating gender ideology with colonization, imperialism, and unwarranted cultural imposition, which has been a prevalent counter-strategy for the global right. As we know, and as we've heard, there's truth to the imposition of this, but this capitalizes on political tensions and deep-seated resentments that rightly pertain to Western liberalism, neoliberal hegemony, and colonialism.
Chloe?
I'm on my conclusion.
Okay, great.
A convening of feminist activists around the world in August 2019 in Mexico City named its collective declaration, Women Radically Transforming a World in Crisis. The activists were unequivocal in their analysis that neoliberal capitalism is a key driver of the current global crises, exacerbating existing inequalities of power. Populist, right-wing, and backlash politics, as well as co-opted neoliberal feminisms, function to distract from this reality, offering instead simplistic solutions centered around ordering the intimate politics of body, family, and nation as sites of struggle over discursive meaning and material resources. So finally, in the view of the global crisis of capitalism, in their notes for a feminist manifesto, Aruza et al. Open with the question, will we reimagine gender justice in an anti-capitalist form, which leads beyond the present carnage to a new society? This question has helped animate our effort to reconceptualize backlash as more than a reaction to alleged feminist gains, and gesture towards a counter-spatiality of an anti-capitalist and anti-racist feminism that can confront backlash. A counter-spatial feminist politics must also seek to unfix the silos, both sectoral and geographic, into which so much of the global feminism critiqued by Watkins has been confined by the pressures of NGOization. This is a spatial politics of movement confluence, transnational in organizing, and systemic in its analyses and vision, evident, for example, in the global strike movement. As Vergis suggests, such a feminism also draws on a temporality of struggle that can overcome the nihilism and nostalgia at the heart of the effective forces of backlash. As she writes, daring to make a leap in time, daring to imagine a world in which humanity is not divided into lives that matter and that lives do not, has always been a part of the political pedagogy of the oppressed. As binaries and divides are violently reimposed and reiterated, it's only through truly unfixing and unmooring power and privilege that a radical transformation of the deep structures of power can be imagined and reenacted. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chloe. I really like the conclusion, and we'll get to talk about it. But خلينا نرجع للناس اللي معنا، وإذا في أسئلة يا جماعة طبعا بتقدروا تبعتوا على الشات أو بتقدروا ترفعوا إيدكم. ريما سبقتيني، يلا ريما.
حسيت إنه حدا لازم يحكي.
Okay.
يعني. Thank you all. Those were really, really challenging presentations. So I want to start with Anna, and it was such an interesting talk for me to sit through, because I came up in that generation you're talking about, in that transition. I was in graduate school in a Marxist anthropology department in the US, when suddenly sort of Foucault and Derrida came in. I was also at the first Third World Feminist Conference that was ever held in the US, where Chandra Mohanty, gave her first great big talk based on the very famous paper that we know from way back in the 80s. And Gayatri Spivak was there, and these were unknown names. But I want to take you on a couple of things, and in some ways it relates a bit also to Francis's reading. Because I from a Marxist point of view, I found your reading very idealist, right? That it was very much about intellectuals who have certain kinds of projects, but somehow they were disconnected from changes in the whole, power distribution in the world, in the way that capitalism operated, in the, transition, the Reagan and Thatcher era that changed everything, not just in the West, but this was basically a global revolution that led us to where we are now, right? And so, for instance, James Scott, who you see as the kind of pivotal figure and the book Weapons of the Weak, I really want to differ with you. I also want to differ with you over the role that Gramscian analysis played at that period. I think one way to really defend sort of the rise of Gramsci in Western academies is when you look at the work of Stuart Hall, right, the great critical race theorist in the UK under Thatcherism. And he wrote a pivotal essay on Gramsci because Gramsci became the way to try and understand why the working class was not following its own material interests, why the race and class issues were siloed from each other in the UK, you know, and all of this happening while the labor movement was being crushed. So James Scott, who also took up Gramsci in Weapons of the Week, had also this very wide resonance because under the Reagan-Thatcher era, there was this incredible sort of way in which the working class, you know, and if you're talking Marxism, I'm sorry, you know, it's kind of pretty central, especially in the West. We're basically buying, very much like we're seeing now, very much like we're seeing in Chloe's presentation, just buying everything that was against their own interest and against their own location. So the whole issue of hegemony, the whole issue of culture and things like that became crucial to Marxist thinking in those contexts. And so, you know, it's very striking to me. I agree with you, Anna, the way that James Scott got taken up. And I think that's maybe also something that both of you maybe are missing. I think your reading is also in some ways very, when you talk about Western thought, you're actually talking very much in an America-centric kind of way. The way that Gramsci got taken up in America, the way that Foucault got taken up in America was very, very different in the way that he got taken up in other places. America always gets rid of the material dimension of struggles, you know, and there's a Marxist reading of Foucault. There's a version of Foucault which is very, very useful for radical thinking, also connected to a materialist kind of way. But that would never happen in America. I mean, Derrida was the star in America more than Foucault, right? Anyway, I could go on and on, but you know, I think you're both missing the way that really the collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of, you know, Reagan-Thatcher and to reshape the world and to reshape hegemonic discourses and ways of doing things was so crucial in all of this. It was absolutely so crucial in all of this. So thinkers are important, but thinkers are also reflecting the times, or they're trying to engage with the times. I think that's sort of all that I'm saying. Anyway, thank you both. Thank you both.
Thank you, Rima. So can I take questions, a bunch of questions first, and then Yani, leave it to you to answer, because there are hands. Arine? Arine? Arine معنا؟
عرين وين رحتي؟
المشكلة الإيد لسه موجودة بس عرين مش موجودة. Okay, so Anna, okay, maybe I'll ask my question, which is very related to Rima's question. So maybe you don't have to. My question is actually for both of you, Frances and Anna. So I totally agree, actually, with what you said about neoliberalism. I think I'll take Rima's side when it comes to Foucault and well, Gramsci, but mainly Foucault, I think. The thing is, when I think about it, I do understand what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. But I think we're asking maybe the wrong question. We know what happened after. We're living it, but maybe we need to ask, why did it collapse? Why did it lose the battle? And to actually think that, okay, so for me, Marx is two things: do away with the state and do away with wage labor. These were not done. The Soviet Union did not do it. Most of the socialist states did not do it. I don't think they deserve the word socialist state. And as much as better they were than other capitalist, really laissez-faire states, they're still capitalist in a way, in Marxist terms, and not Marxists. I'm not, I cannot, I think there's a big gap between what Marx has written and what the Marxist has not has done, or with him, his theory and the application and the understanding of the theory. And this is where the socialist feminists come in. So they're not dupes. I agree, Francis. They've been part of the revolution. But again, the revolution was seeing them as fighters. Fighter is fine, but laborers is not fine. Turning them in Cuba, one of the best examples, women just left the labor market. They chose to leave the labor market because the labor market is not revolutionary enough. It's not socialist, even if Castro was. So we have to think about, again, what happened? Why did people abandon socialism or the revolution? Again, that doesn't mean it. I think we need to get out of we're either socialist as going back in time to socialism, or we're either, I think, again, Spivak is another person that maybe we need to listen to. And when we think that, we need to go back to Marx, but not Marxism. We cannot go back in history if we are Marxists anyways. So that's one part of the question. And my other question is a Spavikian question. When we talk about the English, and we're actually communicating now in English, I do have a problem that to read Latin American literature or to read African literature, I'll have to read it in English because I cannot read all these. So that's one question. And then I'll ask Spivak's and Benjamin's harsh question. How do we position ourselves as intellectuals and as feminists, theorizing feminists and academic feminists in the word mode of production? Because actually this is, we need to start by questioning how do we produce theory and from which position do we produce theory. عرين رجعتي؟
Yeah, do you hear me?
يلا دورك.
Yeah, do you hear me? سامعيني?
سامعينك هلا.
Okay, I'm sorry I cannot open the camera. First, thank you all. It was very interesting and I enjoyed the presentations academically, but mainly politically. I like the attitude, so thank you very much. My question is for Chloe. Do you still hear me? I'm very sorry for Do you hear me, Amira?
سامعينك. شوي الصوت بعيد عرين بس سامعين.
Okay, I'm sorry. My question is for Chloe. You talked about the masculinity crisis. Can you clarify more? Are you talking about a masculinity crisis compared to women or compared to other men? Is it for the privileged men or the unprivileged men? You also wrote something about a masculinity crisis in a settler colonial context. I would like to hear a little bit more. Thank you very much all.
حدا تاني؟ في كمان أسئلة؟ Okay, so start with Anna.
Yes, thank you for the questions and for the discussion. There is a lot to say because I'm really talking about the book, and I have a chapter and an article coming out on Marx and Western Marxisms and many lives of Marxisms in the 20th century and the 21st century in the West. I also have a chapter on Foucault, which is also an article that's called, I'm proud of this title, it's called Fixed Openness of History. Fixed Openness of History. I'm quite critical of Foucault, what Foucault actually contributed to kind of fundamentally to historical and social sciences. So this article is about that. And then there is this article on agency. So yes, I would like first to address this question of what kind of role do I give to those kind of feminist scholars and social scientists who actually produce this Western epistemology, which I think, yes, of course, yes, I'm focusing specifically on the US as the source that actually exports this terminology basically all over the world. Like even today, we use terms and categories which were created in the 80s and 90s, and we cannot really carry on our conversation without engaging with what was produced during those very very eventful period. And if I presented them as the makers and kind of creative but disconnected intellectuals who basically kind of were working disconnectedly and didn't realize what was happening in the world, this is actually not what I wanted. I didn't. It's not what I intended. I just focused on this on the categories because I think it's good to to explicate exactly what was happening and how these categories changed, and how powerful they became, and how now they can actually allow Western scholars to study the oppressed and the colonized by just looking at the surfaces of their existence, and actually have a feeling that they have made a huge difference in the world, right? So I mean, I cannot be persuaded that this is not the case. But I do not think that they created this from scratch. I basically treat them as uncritical reflectors of larger geopolitical and geopolitical changes in the world, because this kind of, and here I'm very indebted to basically to the Marxists who have been writing since 1980s. So actually no one prevented feminist scholars in the 80s and 90s from reading Frederick Jameson or David Harvey, who basically you can see striking parallels between kind of the ideology of neoliberalism and appeals to the society to constantly, to kind of the neoliberal ideology that basically proposes to human beings to constantly reinvent oneself, to enjoy in constant remaking of oneself, to get rid of any kind of predictability, and be basically very much coherent with this idea of destruction of predictable structures and networks. So this rhetoric of kind of this neoliberal discourse is just a match made in heaven with post-structuralist conversation that celebrates fragmentation, mutability, like self-constant self-reinvention, with kind of in the world which is being deprived precisely of basic kind of ways of kind of persevere and even to predict the future. So this is the larger context. I think that to me that's just a granted, right? But I'm very interested in this kind of because I'm also speaking to Western scholars who tend to believe that their categories of analysis have a profound emancipatory potential. So I actually do need to go into kind of this detail and show that emancipatory potential actually was dead in the very beginning, because not because the categories are wrong, but because the categories are not connected to deeper structures. So this is that I just want to clarify that, like, of course, they're not really being disconnected. They're being very connected, but they're not aware, or they're not taking it. They're basically abandoning Marxism just when Marxism could have helped them to actually to contextualize and create a critical distance to this kind of remarkable falling in love with this type of with a post-structuralist and postmodernist analytics. And as far as on Marxism, yeah. So again, like I focused on kind of grounded this kind of this totalizing forms of knowledge as being equated with Marxism, and of course I completely agree that the Marxists, the British and American Marxist traditions by 1980s, especially the Gramscian Marxist tradition, was one of the most sophisticated intellectual kind of traditions which combined all different circuits of mediation of how society produces an individual, right? Like economic circle, social relations circle, the ideological, the cultural, and all of those circuits of mediation, basically, kind of the challenge of basically the way I think that like Marxism actually provides us with the most developed theory of mediation because mediation for Marx and Marxists, specifically Gramscian, takes place not just within the cultural realm, but within an economic realm, because every economic form misrepresents itself. Like money is not what it is, goods are misrepresenting of how they're being produced. This private property is not really private property, it's social property. So everything in the world is basically perceived by 1980s by rather regular Western Marxists as being a product of multiple forms of mediation by society. So when post-structuralists come in and actually foreground culture, they actually narrow down the interpretive framework that had existed before the 1990s, right? And now there is a return. Now there is this kind of way of bringing it back. So in my article, I actually point out this remarkable unjust critique of Marxism that was produced within this moment of post-structuralist emergence of this post-structuralist analytics that actually simplified Marxism and created Marxism that never existed, right? So in order to critique it.
Can you go slower for that interpreters to be able to keep up with you?
I already finished, I'm sorry. I can, right, I mean, I'm sorry, when I was reading my text, I was very disciplined, and now I'm not disciplined. I have not been disciplined, unfortunately.
Now you're excited.
Yes, yes. Just a comment on the Soviet Union. I mean, we can have a conference on that, but I'm a Soviet historian, and I do not think the Soviet Union collapsed. I think the category of collapse is misrepresenting what had taken place in the Soviet Union in the 1980s and early 90s. It was not, if I disagree with this narrative to that degree, then we have, clearly there is a lot more to say. And about to what degree it was capitalist. This is actually there is a new scholarship coming out within the field of Soviet history, where people are finally start actually engaging with how much socialist, I do use the term socialist because the differences are so dramatic with the way the working class was treated, with the way the final product was distributed. The differences in kind of economic differentiation within the Soviet society was minuscule. Basically, it was inconsequential, and no one understood that until real differences came in, economic differences. So this is a very big question, and I just want to alert us that there will be new work coming out that actually will look at Soviet socialist economy, not just in its kind of 1930s framework when the Soviet Union basically was industrializing and going through very kind of catastrophic mode of development, but what happened to Soviet society and capital an economy once it got kind of domesticated and was being reformed after World War II. So that's just I wouldn't just kind of right away say that they collapsed and there was no socialism.
Yeah, of course. Okay, Frances.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a, there are a lot of things were said, and I mean, I do disagree on James Scott, but I don't have time to get into it. And yeah, and I definitely don't want to get into it in a public space. So I just want to say that more generally, that maybe a year, couple of years ago, I just started thinking, wow, I think we're in a 100-year turning point, right? And I was thinking about 1917, the Balfour Declaration, World War I, and all the kind of disappointments of decolonization for the places that were decolonized. And let's face it, the hegemonic, the US hegemony that essentially emerged out of World War II. And then watching the world, and I do connect on activist and intellectual levels with lots of people across the world and follow a lot of what's happening, even with the language limitations. I think we're actually in a 400 or 500 year shift. I don't know where that's going, and I don't think many people do, but I do think that as feminist scholars, activists, as leftists, as social, I think we have to think differently and do differently. And I do connect the doing and thinking. And I don't know, yeah. So I would also say being like a follower of the theorists like Stuart Hall, and I teach Stuart Hall and other really interesting people today and who have not passed. I don't think Stuart Hall, I don't buy the Europeans were better. I don't buy that. So, and I don't buy it today either, by the way. So I don't think that that is backed up in terms of the political, intellectual, the concept development. In all places, all over the world, there are people who are doing, producing, acting, in the ways, let's say Stuart Hall did. So I think that the question is, what gets elevated, what actually gets prioritized? And I'm a Gramsci stan also, and teach Gramsci's work. And so I think, yeah, I just think that we really have to be working on multiple scales in how we're thinking. And I find that in the world, the people from Marxist, I'm thinking also of African, Sankara, Rodneyist, all kinds of people have been thinking in different ways and producing different kinds of knowledge. And we do have gaps. I have to do a lot of work at this conference in Mexico City, everything or most things were in Spanish and some things were in Portuguese, and that kind of tracks earlier empires, English tracks British imperialism, which implicates most of us, and including in the US. And so, yeah, but then, okay, so how do we cross those boundaries? I don't know. I just wrote a lot of little comments, but I don't want to take up too much time.
Thank you, Frances. Chloe?
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question actually to add to Irene's. So I really like your idea about the body, the nation as the fixed places, and the family, of course. But I was thinking how much your analysis takes into consideration the international division of labor when it comes to these three places, because, so the body is usually the white male's body that should remain heterogeneous, but in Palestine, for example, the Zionist government is actually trying to push for and while the ultra-right in the Zionist state are actually advocating against queer and homosexual rights, but and when it comes to Palestinians, they are trying actually to impose it into the curriculum, and so it becomes part of people's resistance. It takes the form of the culture, but you cannot just ignore the colonial, the family. So Black women and Kalpana and us were talking about that yesterday, that for Black women, for colored women, for Vietnamese women, Indonesian women, and Malaysian women, the family is not the priority, the working for the family. So women's role is not to reproduce, but actually to bring income for their family. A good mother, the good wife is actually today the one who works and brings and who reproduces less in the third world. So while the white woman should reproduce more, the colored woman is not, the colonized woman is not supported. So again, how much can we actually, and to go back to not fragmenting, but I'm not trying to fragment. Actually, I'm using a Marxist analysis when I talk about international division of labor. So how do we make sense of these differences? Because they do exist in reality. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll speak first to Irene's question on masculinities in crisis. And I think the thing to say about that is that discourse is kind of used by different people in different ways in relation to different men. And I think sometimes it's kind of, it can be helpful, and I think sometimes it can be incredibly unhelpful. So there's obviously the Trumps and the Andrew Tates and the Bolsonaros of this world and the manosphere that, and they talk about a crisis in masculinity in the sense that did some research into the manosphere and it was horrible, but the idea being that they're raising, and they use the language of conscientization around male oppression under female domination. So this idea that men are being disenfranchised by feminism, by queer politics and so on. And then that plays out in lots of different ways. And so in relation to what I was talking about, for example, strongman politics of kind of reimposing the idea of masculinity as strong, as in control, as patriarchal. And then that plays out again in different spaces. So even in relation to climate change, for example, there's some really good work on petro-masculinities where there's the idea that fossil fuels have helped buttress white male patriarchy. And so therefore, stuff around climate change is a threat to that, and that to not use climate change would constitute a crisis in masculinity. Then I think there's the developmental discourse that's been used to basically vilify working class men. So to, for example, attribute domestic violence always to a crisis in masculinity. You know, men are disenfranchised, men are not the breadwinners anymore, that kind of obscures the fact that domestic violence is prevalent across all different classes of men. And then in relation to the settler colonial context, and thanks, Irene, for asking that, because I can self-promote my paper that's coming out on the sexual politics of settler colonialism that obviously targets its attack so much on the gendered fabric of the colonized and targets its attack very differently on different genders. And one such way, of course, is through the everyday sexualized humiliation of Palestinian men and women, Palestinian political prisoners, and so on. So I think it depends from what position we're talking about a crisis in masculinity and for what politics. I still think that talking about a crisis in masculinity can kind of further patriarchal frameworks of what masculinities and femininities mean. But I think it can be a helpful discourse to think through, for example, the way in which the colonizer is attempting to undo and humiliate different Palestinians of different genders or indigenous people of different genders. In relation to your question, Irene, yeah, I think that's it. I think that's why as well, kind of backlash or populist forces do so well in talking about gender as ideological colonization, because there is the reality of pinkwashing and there is obviously the reality as well of the gender and development agenda as a form of colonization, and gender narratives around gender and sexuality have been used in colonial ways. But I think it can also be, they're kind of co-opting that discourse, I would say. I mean, it'd be really interesting to talk further about this if we had more time, because I think it's a really because I think there is truth to it, obviously, right? And pinkwashing and all the rest of it. But then I think also the idea, for example, that queer people are a Western import, for example, that being something that's obviously incredibly unhelpful. And then your final point on the international division of labor. Yeah, I mean, I'd really like to talk more to you and Kapana about that. I'm not sure I can say anything particularly helpful about it now, but I think it's more for me around how people organize families, it's differently expressed in different contexts, as you say, and I think that plays out in different contexts. So without much time, obviously I was talking about retraditionalization, but in different contexts as well, it might be that, as you said, a good woman goes out and kind of and gathers income for the family. So I think it's kind of contextually contingent, and I didn't answer that very well. I apologize.
Thank you, Chloe. Frances, did you want to say something?
Yeah, in a way, it picks up on your comment and question, which I was thinking and writing. And I mean, I am surprised because for those of us about certain things. One is that for those of us who are like transnational feminists, whatever that means, which, you know, Fernandez has a really great critique of that category. And so, but we're working, or we live in multiple sites. We're like from multiple sites. So we never bought the idea of a global project on feminism. And no matter how much we kept trying to build one, and I would say the same for queer, it was, there's just deep kinds of problems, and that I have struggled with because I've been in actually women's studies programs because I was trained in social science category departments that weren't open to, they're not open to a lot of us, and the ways in which certainly it was not inviting for me, and especially working on Palestine. So it's like, for sure, that's what my dissertation, that was, you know, that's my oeuvre. And it's hostile, in fact, to free thinking. But I also think it's about ways in which the question dominates more than the discipline. So then, you know, you're kind of ghettoized into women's studies, and we're in a women's studies conference, and where that's the place where you talk about gender and sexuality, and you're allowed to talk about it in multiple disciplines and interdisciplinary ways. But I thought we were always suspicious of those of us like Mohanty, for example, or Leila Fernandez today, or I could name multiple names, and I cite some of them in my paper, but we were always, so I am no longer, you know, I just don't think that way. And this, you know, I was in Mexico City last year for just personal reasons, and I stayed around where the U.S. Embassy is, and the U.S. Embassy has the Progress flag, the Progress Pride flag, which is the trans queer flag, and I found it incredibly like ironic, or I don't know what you want to say about that. So I don't like the way in which these projects and their symbolics travel, and they're so closely attached to these Western imperialist projects. And I'm in a state where there's an attack, and I'm near other states where there's an attack on reproductive rights. You all, some of you know that I have a book on abortion in historic Palestine and sex and reproduction. So we know there are contradictions there, but there are contradictions right here around transgender, you know, and somehow in certain settings where it works for the United States, those global categories and symbolics travel really well, and they travel really well in Europe. And I know Europe is itself a complicated construct, but I just want to say, I think they travel really well in Europe. And on a positive note, I want to say that's related to that is I do take one of the persons I cited, that what if we actually just struggled more within, we struggled across, but we struggled within our societies, because when I look, I see a lot of really wonderful things, and they're not new, that are struggles, including around gender and sexuality, that are various. They're not going to look the same as, I don't know, as something that gender and sexuality scholars have theorized and all the articles we read or translate or whatever. So what would a multipolar, a more historical, more humble approach to masculinities, femininities, feminisms, sexualities, what would it look like? And I do believe it cannot just happen in the classroom or in the peer-reviewed secondary source journals.
Okay. Thank you, Frances. Thank you, Chloe and Anna. That was actually, it is actually an unending discussion, but unfortunately we'll have to end. Hopefully we'll have future discussions about all these issues and the possibilities of revisiting Marx again and thinking about the bodies and families and how they're being used or exploited. But thank you again. شكرا كتير اللي كانوا معنا في هدول الجلستين، وإن شاء الله إنه بنلتقي في مؤتمر السنة الجاي، وبيكون عندنا يعني النقاشات اللي هي مهمة لمجتمعات تحت الاحتلال ونسائها اللي يعني بدها تتحرر من مجموعة من القوى القمعية مع بعض. يعطيكم العافية وشكرا كتير للمترجمين، ومتأسفين كتير على أي ضغط سببناه خلال المداخلات أو النقاش.
Thank you. شكرا. ألف شكر. سلام.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. We'll be in touch.
Bye. شكرا. مع السلامة.
Bye. Bye.